This talk is based on a paper that I published in the Reports for the National Centre for Science Education, co-authored with Peter Jacobs. It was a response really to some scientists saying that we shouldn't be talking about scientific consensus, we shouldn't be using it as a communication message. But I thought I'd also take a step back and speak about an even broader issue. Over the last month, a climate scientist posted a blog post where essentially he asked social science, what is it good for? And his conclusion was basically absolutely nothing, and kind of. And so I think I felt obliged to defend the honour of my field, and I jumped on his blog post, posted a comment arguing that not only does social science have a lot of important contributions to the world, but to also the issue of climate communication. I also argued that, in fact, scientists it's an imperative that scientists are evidence-based in how we approach climate communication. And that includes looking at surveys, looking at social science research into how people think about climate change, what are the drivers of climate attitudes, but also looking at what cognitive psychology has to tell us about how people update their climate beliefs in response to information. So let me give an example. This has been the focus of my research. Looking at one particular climate attitude or climate perception, which is perception of scientific consensus about whether humans are causing global warming. And there's been a number of studies looking at this. I'm just quoting Ding et al. From 2011, but there's been a number of studies subsequently that have found that perception of consensus is like a gateway belief. It influences a whole range of other beliefs, including whether climate change is happening, whether humans are causing it, and possibly most importantly, support for mitigation policies. Also, randomised experiments that explore causal links between information and climate beliefs have found that when you communicate the scientific consensus, that significantly increases acceptance of human-caused global warming. The research done by Stefan Lewandowski, sitting in the second row here. And despite the importance of scientific consensus, there's a significant gap between what the public think. In my own data, I've found it around when you ask people how many climate scientists agree about human-caused global warming, the average answer is around 55%. And there's a big gap between 55% and the actual 97% consensus. And for that reason, communication experts such as Ed Maibach are urging the scientific community to talk about the high level of agreement among climate scientists. Now, there's been several objections to communication messaging, and one of them is arguing that, well, the public opinion has moved on. The issue of consensus, that's back in 2009, that's pre-ClimateGate. We don't really need to talk about that anymore. And interestingly, another argument against consensus messaging is that public opinion has not moved on, and therefore we shouldn't be talking about consensus messaging. And the argument here, it's a bit more nuanced, but Dan Kahan argues that because people's cultural values has such an influence on how they think about consensus, how they think about climate change, it means that Democrats are more likely to accept the consensus, Republicans are less likely to accept the consensus, and therefore communicating the consensus only shifts Democrats up, shifts Republicans down, and the net effect is nothing, which is why he argues there's been no shift over the last decade. Now, the data I've collected, and this is consistent with other data collected in the Six Americas report by Ed Maibach, looks at, well, this data really answers both objections at the same time. This is perceived consensus across the political spectrum. So as you move towards the right, you get more conservative, and perceived consensus drops. Now, there's two features, or three features in this graph. Firstly, that slope of the line shows that there is clearly a cultural bias. Political ideology has a big influence on how people think about consensus. But there's still, even for the people on the left who are predisposed to accept climate change, there's still a significant gap between what they think and the 97% consensus. And this means that there is either an information deficit, they're not aware of it, or there's a misinformation surplus, which means that they've been misled by misinformation casting doubt on the consensus. Oh, hang on, can I go back one actually? So that addresses the first issue. Has the public debate moved on? Clearly not. This is over the last year I collected this data. The public is still misinformed. They still think, or significant amounts of the public still think that there is significant disagreement among the climate science community. But again, it also shows that cultural cognition is not the full story. There's two stories here. There's the information deficit or misinformation surplus and cultural values. Another objection, and I think this one is more interesting and worth looking at, is the argument that scientists should be talking about evidence, not consensus. We don't decide scientific truth by vote. It's based on considering the full body of evidence. And interestingly, I think whether this is actually a question we can look at with evidence, because well, I did one test where I compared consensus messaging versus evidence-based messaging. Like here are two interventions I did in an experiment where for one group I showed them on the left a message about consensus. For the other group on the right, I showed them a message about evidence, about the human fingerprints on climate change. And what I found was, compared to a control group who received no message, the people who received the evidence increased their acceptance of climate change, but the people who received the consensus messaging, there was a statistically significant higher increase in acceptance of climate change compared to evidence. So I think what's happening here is this is indication that people use expert opinion as a heuristic or a mental shortcut to guide their opinions about complex scientific matters. And that's where the scientists are from Mars, lay people are from Venus comes from, that we need to recognise the way people think about science. And actually, scientists aren't any different to that too. When we look at areas outside of our expertise, we rely on scientific experts in exactly the same way that lay people rely on us when thinking about climate science. Whoops, I just spoiled myself. So, oh no, that's fine, it doesn't matter. Now, so I think that brings an important point, which is that consensus messaging isn't about proving human-caused global warming. We didn't prove that humans are causing global warming because there was a consensus. It's just talking about communicating the scientific understanding of climate change and clearing up a key misconception which has a lot of flow-on effects to other climate attitudes. So how do you best communicate the consensus? Now, Ed Maybach has been doing a lot of research in this area and testing lots of different ways of communicating the consensus. And what he found was this phrase was the most effective in increasing acceptance of climate change. And I think this has got a lot of stuff in it, this statement, because it talks not only about the level of agreement, it also talks about the scientific method, that our understanding is based on evidence, that it's not just about agreement, it's about becoming convinced by the evidence. They also looked at other different ways of communicating the consensus besides just textual variations. And I'll just point at one highlight on this. This was looking at text, looking at pie charts, using metaphors to explain the consensus. And the interesting thing here is the red line here is the result with our Republicans. And there's just that, what jumps out is that spike at the top where pie charts were way more effective on increasing acceptance of climate change among Republicans. And that was kind of, I was quite happy to see that result, because prior to this research coming out, that was how we were communicating the consensus. So we all breathed a sigh of relief and mentally thanked Ed for that research. We've also been experimenting with other ways of communicating the consensus. On September the 7th, or 9/7, we ran a campaign, 97 hours of consensus, where every hour we published a caricature of a scientist, as well as a quote from them talking about the human-caused global warming. The two scientists to my left were both drawn in there. I've been telling Simon Donner I'm annoyed that he's cut his hair, because his hair was actually one of the highlights of the whole campaign, particularly when I did the version where it's flying up into the air.
I thought you cut it in there.
No, actually, I might have to redraw it. So quick note, if anyone wants to be involved in 9/7/2015, drop me an email. Now, 3 minutes. Okay, so jumping back to this misinformation surplus, I think that's worth having a look because there's some important stuff in there. As part of my research, I explored what is the impact of misinformation and what can we do about it. Now, for the last 20 years, casting doubt on the consensus has been one of the key focuses of the misinformation campaign. And this is like a history of 20 years of campaigns and messaging. And if you look in the middle, you see the Luntz memo, make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue. One thing that Naomi Oreskes said this week is that one thing that these people are is data-driven. This attack on the scientific consensus is based on market research, exploring what drives people's attitudes about climate change. They knew this stuff a decade before social scientists figured it out, and they were putting in strategies to take advantage of that research. It's a bit ironic that groups that deny climate science are using data-driven approaches to attack the science, and yeah, anyway, it's slightly ironic. Luntz also said this, that to get a message across, you just need to say it over and over and over again until you're absolutely sick of it. And only then are people hearing it for the first time. And this is used for good. This is good advice. Used for evil, we get things like a 20-year consensus gap. So what I've done with my research is test the impact of misinformation. And so for one experiment, I showed this excerpt verbatim from the Global Warming Petition Project, arguing that 31,000 scientists disagree with the consensus. And what I found from this intervention was that this red line shows a change in belief after reading the misinformation, a significant decrease in perceived consensus, where, again, the x-axis is political ideology. So people to the right, more conservative, were more heavily influenced by the misinformation. The graph on the right shows there was also a drop in policy support. Now, I also tested priming people before they saw the misinformation. So they read this information, which basically looked at, explained the technique of fake experts, used the tobacco industry strategy as an example, and then join the dots between that and climate change. And when people read this information, then saw the misinformation, the blue line shows what happened. The misinformation was completely neutralised and even had a slight backfire effect. So explaining the techniques of misinformation and casting doubt on the consensus can actually cause misinformation to backfire. And oh, I'm at the end. I surprised myself. This is a PB. So in summary, climate communication needs to be data-driven. The consensus gap is a significant roadblock to public support for action. And so what the research is telling us is that we need to do simple visual messages and explain the techniques casting doubt on the consensus. 14 seconds. Thank you.
Well, if I can make a comment quickly. As you noted, these results have long been known to practitioners for decades. So on behalf of practitioners everywhere, I thank you for your validation. But I do want to offer another sort of insight from the practitioner community, which is when you want to communicate something, we have a saying, show, don't tell. And so I think one of the problems with consensus messaging is that we tell people there's a consensus, but when climate scientists speak, they do not show a consensus. And I would give two examples of that. The IPCC communication around the so-called hiatus, and recently the debate about the California drought. So I think that the vast majority of communication that people are hearing from climate scientists don't illustrate a consensus, they illustrate something very different. And so what they're hearing is kind of in very contrast with what they're being told. So offer that up for your consideration.